The fens of Lincolnshire kept a cold that did not bluster or announce itself. It came up out of the black soil instead, slow and patient, settling into the floorboards of Thornbury Hall, the way damp settles into old bread. By the spring of 1823, the house had been holding its breath for the better part of 2 decades, and Adelaide Thornbury, who was 26, and had never known it any other way, had learned to live inside that held breath without complaint. That particular morning, she was at the small table. In the east parlour, the one room that caught what little sun the season offered, working through the household accounts by the light of a single tallow candle she had not bothered to put out when dawn came up grey. The ledger was hers, though it ought to have been her father's. Sir Hugh Thornbury could not abide the columns. The sight of his own figures made his hands tremble, and so the work had fallen to Adelaide years ago quietly, the way most necessary things in that house fell to her. She had a clear economical hand and a head for sums, and she knew to the shilling what they owed the chandler in Boston town, and the smith at the crossroads and the bank in Lincoln that no longer answered her father's letters with any warmth. She did not weep over the numbers. She had decided long ago that tears were a sort of spending the family could not afford. And she kept her grief when it came, folded small and put away where no one could see it. Instead, she totted the rose, blotted the page, and listened to the particular music of the house. The loose pane in the morning room that hummed when the wind turned off the sea, the door to the still room that had dropped on its hinge and now sighed when it opened, the silence of rooms that had once held people and now held only sheeted furniture and the smell of old paper. She wore a dress of grey wool, plain as a Sunday in Lent, clean, but with the faint pale shadow at the shoulder seam where it had been let out the winter before. There was no money for new cloth. There was, on a careful month, money for thread. Adelaide did not think of this as hardship. It was simply the shape of her life, and she had made her peace with it the way one makes peace with weather. Her father's footsteps found her before noon, quick, uneven, the gait of a man who had spent 40 years being startled by his own circumstances. Sir Hugh came into the parlour with a letter crushed in his fist and his colour high, and he stopped short when he saw her, as though he had forgotten she would be exactly where she always was. "Adelaide, there you are." "Here I am," she agreed, and set down her pen. "Father, what is it?" "Nothing. Nothing wrong." He waved the letter, and the paper rattled too loudly in the quiet. "An arrangement, a visitor. We are to have a guest this afternoon, and I'll thank you to see he is received properly." She kept her face still. Guests were a rare and expensive event at Thornbury, requiring fires and clean linen and food they did not have. A guest? Who? A gentleman from the north. A Mr. Hale. Her father would not look at her. He busied himself straightening a small portrait on the mantel that had been straight already. A man of affairs. He has an interest in the estate, in our position. The word interest settled in the room like frost on a window. Adelaide understood it for what it was. A man with an interest in their position was a man who had come to weigh their land, their roof, their last few acres of fen, and to put a price on what was left. He was a creditor come to look at his collateral, and everything underneath her father's brittle cheerfulness told her so. "I see," she said. "What would you have me do?" "Only be at table. Mrs. Tarrant is contriving a dinner." He attempted a smile and did not quite manage it. "We must show well, Adelaide. It is of the very first importance that we show well. Wear something suitable." She understood the instruction beneath the instruction. Suitable meant invisible. It meant she was to be a quiet, well-mannered piece of the furniture, an ornament of the family's faded gentility, neither seen too much nor heard at all. She was not to have opinions. She was, in short, to be a daughter, a relic of a name that was, at present, worth rather less than the paper their debts were written upon. "Of course," she said, when he had gone, fretting already over which of the dreadful sherries to put out. She climbed the cold staircase to her room and considered the 3 gowns that hung in her wardrobe. There was the dark green that pinched across the back. There was the blue that had been respectable 2 seasons gone and was now only sad. And there was the grey, her oldest and plainest, the one she wore for the garden and the still room, and the long ordinary days that made up her life. It was the colour of slate and winter water, and of not being noticed, and she put it on without hesitation, because it suited what she expected the afternoon to be. The carriage, when it came, was not grand. It was a plain, dark travelling coach, unmarked, but it was sprung beautifully and kept like a surgeon's instruments, and the 4 horses that drew it were another thing entirely. Tall, glossy, black as wet coal, animals of a breeding that made the Thornburys' one old mare in the paddock look like a creature of a whole different and humbler order. Adelaide watched from the landing window as a man in dark, sober clothes climbed down. He did not look up at the crumbling face of the house or the weeds that had taken the gravel. He simply stood a moment, very still, and then turned for the door, which her father was already hauling open, with a welcome that bordered on desperation. She came down as the men entered the hall. Her father was talking. The weather, the state of the roads, the dreadfulness of the Lincoln coaches. In a bright, nervous stream, the visitor said almost nothing. He handed his to old Pell without a word, and his movements were spare and exact, a man who wasted neither motion nor speech. Then he raised his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark, not grey, not pale, but a deep and steady brown that gave nothing away. He was tall enough, but lean rather than imposing, with the slight favouring of one leg that spoke of an old injury borne so long it had become merely the way he walked. His hands, she noticed, were faintly stained at the fingers, the ink of a man who did his own accounts. For one disconcerting moment she had the sense that he saw the whole of it. The worn stone underfoot, the threadbare patch at her father's elbow, the careful poverty of the grey dress she had chosen so deliberately. He saw the shabby truth of them, and he did not look away from it, and he did not pity it. He only took its measure. "My daughter," Sir Hugh said, with relief. "Adelaide, Mr. Hale." He inclined his head. "Miss Thornbury." His voice was low and unornamented, plain as her dress. "Mr. Hale," she answered, and curtsied, and the silence afterward was not a comfortable one. Dinner was a small ordeal. Mrs. Tarrant had worked a quiet miracle out of nothing. A passable soup, a roasted fowl, a baked pudding of last autumn's apples. But the air at the table could have soured milk. Her father carried the conversation almost single-handed, his voice climbing higher with every monosyllable. The guest returned, talking of drainage schemes and the price of wool and a prize ram from a decade past. Mr. Hale ate cleanly and without comment. He did not flatter the food, but he finished his plate. He drank the poor sherry without flinching, and all the while his gaze moved over the room and read it. The brown stain spreading on the ceiling, the chip in the rim of his glass, the way the candle flame shuddered in the draught from the ill-hung windows. He was not a guest. He was a man taking an inventory. He addressed her only once, his voice cutting clean through her father's account of the ram. "The land here," he said, "it floods, I think, in a wet spring." She was so unaccustomed to being asked anything that the question felt almost improper. "It does, sir. The lower fields. My grandfather laid drains, but they have wanted clearing these 10 years, and we have not the men. So you grow what the high ground will bear and let the rest go to water. We grow what will keep us," she said simply. "The orchard does well. The dairy pays for itself. The wheat is a gamble we cannot always afford to make." He was quiet a moment, considering her. "That is an honest way to farm," he said at last. "You feed the household first and ask the land for nothing it cannot give." It was not a compliment, not precisely. It was a statement of fact, and yet it was the first thing said at that table all evening that had the ring of truth in it, and when she met his dark eyes across the candlelight, she had, for one unsteady instant, the sensation of being looked at. Not as a baronet's daughter, not as a fixture, but as a person who had made a hard choice sensibly. The feeling was so unfamiliar that it left her almost dizzy. After the meal, she excused herself and left the men to the last of the tolerable brandy, for she knew the true conversation was about to begin. She did not go to the drawing-room. She went to the library, which was the one room at Thornbury she loved without reservation, a long, cold chamber of books that were the only inheritance of real worth her family had left. There she stood at the tall window in the dark, not lighting a lamp, and watched the moon lay a band of silver across the fen, and waited. It was very late when the door opened behind her. It was her father. He had aged a decade since morning. His shoulders had folded inward, and his face in the moonlight was the colour of ash. "He has made an offer," Sir Hugh said, and his voice was a dry husk of itself. She turned. "To buy the estate? No." He lowered himself into the cracked leather chair, and the springs groaned. "Not to buy it, to keep it. Adelaide, we are finished. The debts are worse than I have ever let you know. By Michaelmas, there will be men at the door. Everything will go." She had known the substance of this for years. What she had not known was the date. Michaelmas was scarcely half a year away. "And Mr. Hale's offer," she said gently. Her father could not meet her eyes. He stared at his hands, which were knotting together in his lap. "His name is not Hale alone. Hale is the name he uses when he wishes to travel without being known. He is Gabriel Hale, the Earl of Westmere." She felt the blood leave her face. Not a creditor's agent, not a man of affairs. An earl, one of the great northern names, sitting in their threadbare dining room, eating their stringy fowl. The thing made no sense. It was an absurdity, a contradiction set down in the middle of their ruin. "Why?" she managed. "He wants a wife." The words came in a rush now, tumbling out of her father in his haste to be rid of them. "He is the last of his line. It is his duty, and he has no patience for the London season, for some painted girl and her scheming mother, and a courtship dragged out over a 12-month. He wants it done plainly, quickly. He will settle every debt we owe. He will see Thornbury kept and me provided for to the end of my days. In return," he stopped. "In return he wants me," Adelaide said. It was not a question. She understood it all at once, with a cold and dreadful clarity. She was a good bargain, a baronet's daughter, an unspoiled name, no greedy relations to make trouble, a woman so far past the edge of ruin that she could not, would not, dared not refuse. She thought of the way he had measured the room. She thought of his one true sentence at the table, "That is an honest way to farm," and understood that she herself had been farmed exactly so. Fed enough hope to keep her, and asked for nothing she could not give. "He wishes for your answer in the morning," her father finished, miserable. "Adelaide, there is no other road." She looked back at the moon. She thought of the worn flagstones and the sheeted furniture and the books that were all that was left of them. She thought of her father, foolish and weak and frightened, but hers, facing a debtor's cell. She thought of the rest of her own life laid out before her, like the flat black fen, a long, slow descent into the genteel poverty of an unmarried daughter no one had wanted. Her choice, she saw, was not a choice at all, but it was hers to make, and she meant to make it standing up. She turned to her father, her face composed and her voice level. "Tell his lordship I should be grateful for a quarter of an hour with him before breakfast. I find I have one or two conditions of my own." The Earl received her in the library at first light. He was dressed already, standing at the very window where she had stood the night before. The cold morning light catching the plain dark line of his coat, he turned as she came in. "Miss Thornbury." My lord. She curtsied. She had not slept, but her mind had never felt clearer. My father has carried your proposal to me. He has. It was a flat statement. He did not ask for her answer. He simply waited, which she found she respected. I find the terms acceptable, she said, with two conditions. She watched something move at the back of his dark eyes, surprise or its near cousin, and vanish. The first is this. My father's debts are to be paid in full, but he is not to be handed money. He is to have a fixed allowance, paid through your man of business, with no large sum ever under his own hand. It would not be wise. She had protected him from himself her whole life. She would not stop now. The Earl considered her, then gave a single short nod. A prudent arrangement. Agreed. The second is for myself. She drew a breath. I will be your wife. I will keep your houses and stand at your table and give you an heir if God allows it. But I will not be a thing that is dressed and set in a corner to be looked at. I am not a doll, my lord. I require work that means something, the running of your households, a hand in the management of your estates. If I am to be married, I will be a partner in it, not a possession. The silence stretched out. It was a reckless demand, an outrageous one, from a destitute girl to an earl, and she half expected the cold refusal that would end the matter. Instead, he watched her with a strange, recalculating attention, as though she had turned out to be a different sort of figure on the page than the one he had penciled in. And you believe, he said, with the faintest dry edge, that the running of a great house is work that means something. I believe any work done well means something, she answered evenly. And I believe a house like a field gives back exactly the care it is given. I am very good at giving care. Your households will be run with order and economy and grace. That what I bring to the bargain. He was quiet a long time. She did not look away. At last he said only, Very well, Miss Thornbury, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not yet a smile but stood at the threshold of one. It seems we have an understanding. He put out his hand, not the gesture of a suitor but of a man closing an agreement, and she set hers in it. His grip was firm, and his skin cool, and the ink stain at his fingers stood close to her own. My name, he said, is Gabriel. She withdrew her hand. I shall learn to use it, she said, in time. They were married within the week, a special license fetched from London, with a speed that money makes possible. In the cold little church at the edge of the parish, she wore the grey dress. It seemed the honest thing. Her father wept quietly in the front pew. The Earl stood beside her as still as a carved figure, and when the curate had finished, she changed into her blue and climbed into the Earl's beautiful coach with everything she owned, packed into one modest trunk, and she did not look back at Thornbury Hall, because looking back was a luxury, and she had taught herself to do without those. Westmere Court sat in the high green country of Cumberland, and it was not a house. It was a long, pale palace of stone, with wings spread wide across a park, hundreds of windows looking out over land that ran to the fells. When the coach came up the avenue at dusk, lights bloomed in the lower windows one after another, as if the house itself were saluting them, and a line of 30 servants stood waiting in a hall the size of the village church, their faces shut, their backs straight, the marble floor stretching away under a ceiling 3 stories overhead. It was magnificent. It was also as warm as a vault. The Earl handed her over almost at once to the housekeeper, Mrs. Beckwith, a starched and formidable woman, to Loftus, the butler, who had served the family 50 years, and let his small bright eyes travel over her single trunk, and her plain dress and her want of a maid, and said nothing, and judged her completely. Within the hour Adelaide had been shown to a suite of rooms in the west wing, beautiful and chill, a fire burning that did nothing against the cold of so much height, and a frightened young maid named Nell assigned to unpack the few sad garments that looked laid out in all that French furniture like the belongings of a beggar. That night she dined alone. The Earl, she was told, took his dinner in his study when he was in the country, as he always had. And so began a strange, suspended season of her life. She was a ghost in her own house. She woke and was dressed and ate alone. She walked the long, carpeted corridors where the servants pressed themselves to the walls and dropped their eyes as she passed. She was the Countess of Westmere, a woman of vast authority, and she had never in her life felt so without purpose. Her husband remained a distant figure. A glimpse of him crossing the hall, the back of him riding out to the home farm. They did not speak. He had bought a wife, installed her, and seemed content to forget that he had done so. The library was her refuge, as it had always been. This one rose 2 stories, with a gallery running round the upper shelves, and thousands of books whose spines caught the light from the tall windows. The books did not care that her gown was years out of fashion, or that her dowry had been a mountain of other people's anger. She began to read her way along the shelves, and one afternoon, deep in a treatise on the draining of marshland and the reclaiming of poor ground, she looked up and found him in the doorway, watching her. She had not heard him come. "I had not thought," he said, "that anyone kept such dull books company." She closed it over her thumb. "Your grandfather, it seems, cared a great deal about wet land and what might be made of it." He came into the room. He held that a man owed his duty to the soil first and his title second. He stopped a few feet off and looked at the volume in her lap. "Do you find it interesting?" "I find it reasonable," she said. "A house and a field want the same things: a plan, a steady eye, an understanding of what they are and what they are not." He studied her then, a long, weighing look. "I had braced myself," he said, slowly, "for tears or for demands. Gowns, jewels, a house in Bath. You have asked me for none of it. I am not a child, my lord. We struck a bargain, and I mean to keep my half. I asked for work that means something. As none has been given me, I have set about preparing myself for the day it is." That landed somewhere in him. She watched it land. He looked round the cold, perfect, silent room. The ordered shelves, the gleaming wood, the great unwarmed beauty of it, and for the first time she saw something flicker behind the brown of his eyes that she recognized, because it lived in her too. "This house is kept," she said, more gently than she had meant to. "It is kept beautifully, but a thing can be kept and never once be lived in. There is a difference, and you feel it as well as I do." She had gone too far. She knew it, the instant the words were out. She braced for the cold reply. Instead he was quiet, and then he said very low, "No, it has not been lived in for a long while." And he turned and went out, and left her alone with the books and the echo of it. From there, slowly, the ice gave. It gave by inches, the way thaw comes. A creak here, a trickle there, nothing you could point to. She asked Loftus for the household ledgers, and after a stiff little battle, he surrendered them. She found among the Earl's papers passing through the steward's office a great packet of letters from across the sea, accounts and complaints, and weather reports from a timber estate and shipyard. The family held on the Miramichi, in the colony of New Brunswick, and a wharf at Halifax, in Nova Scotia, all of it left to Gabriel by a younger brother who had gone out to manage it and died of a fever 3 winters past. The colonial papers were a tangle no one at Westmere had the heart to untangle because they smelled of grief. Adelaide, who had no fear of other people's columns, sat down with them. It was the colonial accounts that first drew the two of them into real talk. He came upon her one evening, with the Halifax letters spread across the long table, and instead of leaving he sat and asked what she made of it, and she told him plainly that the agent in St. John was honest but overcautious, that the shipyard was losing money for want of a foreman who would stay through a winter, that there was a fortune in squared pine going down the river to the King's dockyards if a man would only commit to it instead of mourning it. He listened. He truly listened, not from courtesy but because she was right, and a man who runs his own accounts knows the sound of being right. After that he dined in the family room, not the study. She had quietly had the long table taken away, 30 chairs and 20 feet of polished mahogany, at which he had eaten alone for years like a single mourner at a very long grave, and a small round table put in its place, with a jug of whatever the conservatory could spare. He had nearly refused when the change was first proposed to him. Then he had pictured himself at the head of that endless table, and pictured a child there one day, shouting to be heard across the length of it, and had said, "See to it," in a voice that surprised them both. So they took to talking, about the colony, about the fells, about the books, about the drains he meant to lay in the low fields, and whether she would oversee them, which she did. The Dowager Countess arrived in the midst of all this. Lady Augusta, his grandmother, 70 years old, with a tongue like a paring knife and a heart she kept carefully hidden behind it. She took one look at the round table, another at Adelaide's plain gown, a third at the unfamiliar softness about her grandson's mouth, and understood the entire situation inside a minute. "So you are the girl Gabriel bought," she said to Adelaide, the first afternoon, with no preamble whatever. "Tell me, are you afraid of him?" "No, my lady," Adelaide said. "Good. There is nothing to be afraid of. He is all silence and no menace, my grandson. A great deal of very quiet, very cold weather, and not one drop of rain." The old woman peered at her. "He says you demanded to run the house. Have you begun?" "I have been studying the books." "Books," Lady Augusta snorted. "A house is not run out of a book, child. It is run out of the kitchen and the still-room. Come with me." And she swept Adelaide off on a tour of the working heart of the place, tasting the soup and interrogating Mrs. Beckwith about the price of beeswax and praising the polish on the copper, knowing every servant by name and asking after their mothers, and being, in short, exactly the warmth that Adelaide had said the house was missing. "You've sense," she pronounced at the day's end, "and you are no fool, which puts you ahead of 9 women in 10. But your wardrobe is a calamity. We are going to London. It is past time. Gabriel showed the world what he has got, and I will not have them thinking he married a frightened mouse from the marshes." London was a different country. Westmere House in Mayfair was grander even than the court, and the city, after the still fells, was a roar of carriages and candlelight and people who wished to know things, new things. The news of the Earl's sudden secret marriage had run through the drawing rooms like a grass fire, and everyone meant to have a look at her. The Dowager kept her promise. A dressmaker was summoned, and the sitting-room filled with bolts of silk, and Adelaide, who had made a single gown last for years, learned to choose. She refused the frills and feathers that were the fashion, and took instead deep greens and creams and quiet blues, and, against the old woman's expectation, one gown of pale silver-grey silk, that the dressmaker thought too plain by half. "You know what suits you," Lady Augusta said, surprised into approval. "Plainness, when it is chosen and not endured, is a kind of power. Remember that." It was in London that they met Lady Cassandra Vane. She was held to be the loveliest woman of the season. Fair-haired and violet-eyed and rich in her own right, and it had been understood for 2 years that she and her ambitious mother had settled on the Earl of Westmere as their certain prize. Gabriel's silent marriage to a nobody from the fens had been, to Cassandra, a public wound. She came at them across a crowded ballroom at the Hartfields, with a smile sweet enough to set teeth on edge. "My lord," she said to Gabriel, her voice all honey over something sharper, "you have been keeping secrets." Her gaze went over Adelaide head to foot, the simple gown, the small string of pearls, the quiet. "And this is the new countess. How charming." A whirlwind, was it not? Such a romance, one scarcely knows what to believe. Her eyes glittered. "Tell me, do you find London very overwhelming?" It must be so different from wherever it is you come from. Adelaide regarded her with composure. I find London is much like a neglected garden, Lady Cassandra, she said, her voice clear and unhurried, a great deal of colour and noise, and a great deal of nothing underneath. The art of it is to cultivate what is worth keeping and pull up the rest before it takes hold. Cassandra's smile thinned. She had expected a stammering country girl, and met instead a steady eye and a sharp tongue, and for a moment she was wrong-footed. The Earl's hand at the small of Adelaide's back tightened, just once, approval and alliance, and he led his wife away and left the beauty staring after them, with her violet eyes gone narrow and cold. What followed was a long, quiet war, snubs in the park, invitations that failed to come, comments pitched just loud enough to carry. They spoke of Adelaide's plain dresses and her absent dowry and her father's ruin. And Adelaide bore all of it with the same composure she had carried out of the fens, never complaining to Gabriel, never stooping to gossip, gathering instead a small circle of quieter, cleverer people who liked her, precisely because she was not playing the game. And Gabriel watched, and grew angry, a cold, protecting fury that was new to him. He had married for duty and convenience, and found himself somewhere in the long northern evenings and the colonial ledgers and the round table in love with his own wife. And the discovery had startled him like a door blown open. He took to looking for her in crowded rooms. He found his evenings unfinished until he had seen her. He drew her into conversations on purpose to watch the company realize, one by one, what he had married. The war turned ugly at its end. Furious that her cruelty would not land, Cassandra moved from snubs to slander. A story began to creep through Mayfair that Sir Hugh Thornbury had not merely failed but had cheated, had been party to a swindle that ruined small men, and that the Earl had married the daughter not from any tenderness, but because he had been forced to it, to bury a scandal that touched his own affairs. It was a clever lie, sewn through with just enough truth to hold its shape, and it cast Adelaide as the scheming get of a thief and Gabriel as a fool or a victim. Lady Augusta wanted blood. That viper, she hissed, pacing. Gabriel must call her father out. No. Adelaide was pale, but her hands were still in her lap. A duel would only feed it. It would make a whisper into a roar. To answer the thing at all is to grant it weight. I will go on exactly as I have, and I will give it none. But the poison had done its work, and she felt the change. The cruelty reached its height at a musical evening, when the woman beside her rose with great deliberation as Adelaide took her seat, and said, in a voice meant to travel, that the air had grown suddenly close, and she must move, and swept off, leaving Adelaide alone in a small ring of empty chairs, set apart like something diseased, and Gabriel across the room saw all of it. The calculated, public cruelty and the flinch of pain that crossed his wife's face before she folded it away. The cold rage he had been carrying for weeks hardened then into something settled and final. He crossed the room in long strides through the sudden hush, and he stopped before her and put out his hand. "My dear," he said, plainly and clearly, "this music wearies me. Walk with me." And he did not wait for an answer. He took her hand and drew it through his arm, and led her out before all of them, a public, unmistakable choosing of sides. In the dark of the garden, her composure finally cracked, and a single tear got loose before she caught it. "Why does she hate me?" she whispered. "I have done nothing to her." "You exist," he said grimly. "You stand where she meant to stand. It has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with her own thwarted scheming, and I will not have it touch you again." He turned her to face him, his hands light on her arms. "We give the Westmere ball in a fortnight, the great night of the season. You will not hide from it. You will stand at my side as my wife, and we will face the whole pack of them together." A new strength went through her, struck off his certainty like a flint. "Together," she said, The night of the ball, the whole of fashionable London came, because everyone knew it would be the last act of the drama. The great rooms at Westmere House blazed with thousands of candles, and the scent of forced roses and a river of diamonds moved through the crowd, and beneath all the brilliance the tension was a held wire. Cassandra had come early and placed herself at the center of the most poisonous circle in the room. A vision in defiant sapphire, her laugh a little too loud, a general surveying the field before the charge. Adelaide and Gabriel made their entrance, and a hush fell. She was not wearing the Westmere jewels, as half the room had wagered she would. She wore the gown of pale silver-grey silk, the colour of moonlight on still water, cut beautifully, and without a single ornament beyond the small pearls at her throat and ears, her dark hair coiled simply. She was an island of quiet in an ocean of glitter, and she did not look like a woman on the defensive. She looked like a woman entirely at home in her own house, which she was. Gabriel was at her side, saying little, his hand at her back, his attention wholly on her. Cassandra struck near the terrace doors, her circle drawn close behind her for an audience. "Your ladyship," she said, with false and dripping sympathy. "You look pale. I do hope the season has not been too much for you. It must be such labor, living down one's family." The insult landed in a small silence. The listeners caught their breath. Adelaide met her gaze with something close to pity. "On the contrary, Lady Cassandra," she said, and her voice carried in the sudden quiet, "I find a clear conscience does wonders for the constitution. You ought to try one. I am told the relief is remarkable." Before Cassandra could draw breath to answer, Gabriel stepped forward. He did not look at her at all. He passed over her as though she were a chair. His eyes were only for his wife. "Adelaide," he said, "I believe this is our dance." He raised her hand and kissed it with a gravity that silenced the leap nearest them, and then he turned to the room and spoke, his voice carrying without effort to every corner. "My lords, ladies, gentlemen, a moment of your attention." The room went still as glass. "Many of you have met my wife this season. I am not certain that any of you have seen her. You have seen a quiet woman. You have heard whispers, which are the only coin some of this town deals in. But I have watched her face the loss of everything she had, and my own coldness, and the spite of half of London, with nothing but her own steadiness and never once break." He paused, and his dark gaze came to rest on Adelaide's face. "I married for duty. I will tell you plainly as her husband that I have ended by loving her past all my expectation of myself, and that I stand before you tonight as the most fortunate and least deserving man in this room." He held out his hand. "Will you dance with me?" There were tears standing in her eyes when she put her hand in his. "Yes, Gabriel," she said. He led her to the center of the floor, and as the music began, the other dancers drew back until the two of them stood alone in a wide ring of light, and they began to dance, turning, oblivious to the hundreds of eyes upon them, seeing only each other. "I was a fool," he murmured. "I offered you a bargain when I should have offered you my heart. Can you forgive it?" "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her hand tightening on his shoulder. "You looked at me as though I were a person and not a debt. No one had done that in a very long time." Across the room, Lady Cassandra Vane stood quite alone. The Earl had not so much as glanced at her. Her power, built of whispers, had simply evaporated in the heat of one honest sentence, and for a moment her lovely face showed the raw, panicked emptiness underneath it before she turned and fled the room. But Adelaide and Gabriel did not see her go. They saw only each other, turning and turning in the center of the light, two separate lives folding at last into one. The next summer, the gardens at Westmere Court came up wild and full under Adelaide's hand, and the new gardener she had hired. The stiff old patterns softened now, with drifts of lavender and roses let loose to ramble. The house had begun to breathe. There were dogs in the hall, and a child's nursery being aired in the south wing against the autumn, and a long table, a smaller one, at which they meant before long to be more than two. On a warm afternoon she sat on the stone bench with a letter from the agent at St. John open in her lap. News of the shipyard turning a profit at last, and a foreman who meant to stay, and a plan half formed between her and Gabriel that they might sail out themselves one day, west across the water, to see the river of squared pine and the wharf at Halifax with their own eyes. Gabriel came up the path from the rose-beds, ink still at his fingers from the morning's work, and sat beside her and took her hand. "It is a good country by all accounts," he said, nodding at the colonial letter. "Wide, cold in the right way. You would like it, I think." "I should like to see anything," she said, "if you were there, to see it with me." He brought her hand to his lips the way he had on the night of the ball. "I think I loved you," he said, "from the moment you stood in that draughty library and told me my house had never once been lived in. You were the first person in years to say a true thing to me." "I only said what was there to see," she answered. "And you are the only one who ever troubled to see me at all," he said, and looked out over the warm living house behind them. "You brought it back, you know, the warmth to Westmere and to me." She leaned her head against his shoulder and thought of the grey girl who had once gone over the accounts of a dying house by a single tallow candle, certain her whole future was a flat black fen, with nothing in it, and of the woman she was now in the sun, with her husband's hand in hers, and a small new life, turning quietly toward the autumn, and understood that what she held had never been a bargain at all, but a life, built not of titles or jewels, but of patience and plain dealing, and the stubborn, unhurried courage of one well-tended rose.